Welcome to the Connet Ealing Solutions Video Podcast. Episode 4, A Brief History of Bitcoin.
Welcome. Today we're going to talk about Bitcoin. Bitcoin does have a brief history. It's only been around since 2008, but it's certainly a colorful and interesting history. So let's start at the beginning. In October 2008, somebody identifying themselves as Satoshi Nakamoto came forward with a white paper and a suite of software in support of a new virtual currency that he or she had named Bitcoin. Now, it turns out that Satoshi Nakamoto is a pseudonym, and no one's ever been able to identify exactly who the person or persons are that were responsible or behind the Nakamoto name. There's been lots of speculation. One of the strongest cases was a gentleman named Craig Wright, who came forward in 2016. He worked with a journalist at the London Review of Books. It ended up being a very long, probably 20,000 word article on Bitcoin and on Satoshi and on Craig Wright. But in the end, Craig Wright, as you might anticipate, started acting very strangely and mysteriously. And so there was never a full identification. It was never validated completely that he was Satoshi. Actually, he never said he was Satoshi. He said he and a colleague of his that had died in the interim were the two people that really were behind Bitcoin. So I guess the general outcome was that it's likely that he was Satoshi, and if not, he was certainly one of the first group of people that were involved with Bitcoin. So let me explain a little bit what Bitcoin is and why it kind of caught a lot of people's interest once it was put out there in the marketplace in the world. It's, as I mentioned, it's a virtual currency. It has two key features. One is built around cryptography, or being able to encode and decode information, that uses something called public key cryptography, which is generally regarded as the closest thing to an unbreakable code out there. And it also uses a technique called blockchain, which was invented by the Bitcoin creators. I'll get into blockchain a little bit later. How the public key cryptography works is that there's a public key, there's a private key. The private key is held by the individual who owns the Bitcoin. The private key is combined with the public key through some complex mathematics to validate that it's legitimate and that the person who says they own that particular Bitcoin does own that particular Bitcoin. So this solved a problem that a lot of people were having difficulty with, was to how you could have an anonymous currency. That was a key feature that a lot of the early proponents of Bitcoin were interested in. Now, those early proponents was a very interesting group of people. Bitcoin came from the fringes. This was not something that was developed by a central bank or by a nation. Satoshi Nakamoto was certainly somebody that was involved with security, someone was involved with cryptography, and was interested in things like libertarianism, free statism. He was also, or whomever it was, also had some ties into the cypherpunks. So, and so these original folks that really drove the original adoption of Bitcoin, what they were all about was anonymity. They wanted something that was anonymous, something that was outside of the government. And they wanted something that was not centralized. So there was no central authority. All of that was shared across the network. Anyone that was involved with Bitcoin, anyone that installed the Bitcoin software onto their server was a node in the network, and they had kind of an equal vote as to the merits or the credibility of the currency. Obviously, the more people you get on the network, the more people with nodes, the more solid the foundation of the currency becomes. That was the original movement. So who's interested in anonymous transactions and often motivated more by anonymous transactions than anyone? A lot of times it's people that are involved in nefarious pursuits, people that are selling drugs, people that are selling guns, people that are doing things that are illegal, that are outside the purview of what citizens should be engaged in according to their government. And so one of the early proponents of Bitcoin was a dark web website called Silk Road. And Silk Road was run by another pseudonym, a gentleman named the Dread Pirate Roberts. And he was eventually identified by the FBI as a former grad student who was living in San Francisco and kind of running his empire out of coffee shops. So there was a lot of concern within the Bitcoin movement that when Silk Road was shut down, that was going to siphon off a lot of traffic that was supporting Bitcoin. Now, luckily, it turned out it was actually much, much less than anyone anticipated. It was really a blip. When Silk Road went down, there was no huge negative impact on the trading volume and the transactions that were going on with Bitcoin. So Bitcoin continued on its way from kind of that early stage of where it was, it said, around anonymous, non-government transactions. And another group that was very interested in virtual currencies got involved. And they weren't worried about anonymity. What they were looking for was something where they could save their money. They wanted like a commodity, something like a new gold, where they could put their money in and know that it wasn't going to lose its value in a significant fashion. A lot of nations around the globe have been known for devaluing their currency and doing it in such a haphazard manner that their citizens have no recourse to maintain the value of that currency other than to spend the currency as soon as they get it. So a lot of folks that have been involved in these types of nations, lived in these nations, saw Bitcoin as a potential a way to avoid this loss in value through devaluation or inflation of a particular currency. Another positive thing for Bitcoins and virtual currency in general was the ability to do frictionless transactions. I can send a Bitcoin to somebody in Siberia who can send it to somebody in Laos without any need for any kind of fees or transactions. It's frictionless. It just goes on through. Anyone that's been involved in international trade knows that the costs of doing these international wire transfers, moving from one currency to another, a lot of people are in your pocket when you do those types of transactions, and it can really eat into the margins of any type of business you're trying to do. So people see Bitcoin as a way to start doing these transactions and not have to weigh or pay all these outrageous fees that you're going to get from brokers and from people involved with the banks and people involved with the governments. So that's continued to build some momentum around Bitcoin. And anybody that's following business news, you can see Bitcoin is in the news constantly, for both positive and negative reasons. It remains highly volatile. It's been on a very strong run this year, but it's down, it's up, it's down, it's up. It really reacts to what's going on out there in the world and how people are viewing it. On the positive side is that there's lots of people that see very strong benefits to Bitcoin, that it can do a lot of different things for a lot of different people that are out there and trying to do things in capital markets, to do things in the marketplace. And I mean, that brings me back to blockchain. Blockchain is probably the most powerful thing that's come out of Bitcoin. All it is, at a high level, is a decentralized ledger. So everybody that has installed Bitcoin on a node, they keep this ledger, and the ledger is just all the transactions that take place. And when someone makes a new transaction, everybody has to agree the majority anyway has to agree that that's a valid transaction. It gets approved, it goes into everybody's ledger, and everything's identified and approved. So lots of traditional players in financial services, banks, insurance companies, they're starting to see very interesting ways to apply Bitcoin so that they can reduce their costs and they can increase the level of service and the speed of service that they can deliver to their clients. So overall, blockchain is something you're going to hear about as a separate movement. Blockchain originated with Bitcoin. It's an integral part of Bitcoin, but blockchain can do lots of other things outside of the Bitcoin ecosystem. So it said the Bitcoin continues to grow. It said opinions vary widely. Some people see this as the future. I heard a hedge fund manager the other day say he just saw nothing more than a Ponzi scheme. And you could make a case for that at this point in time in its developments. Years are going to, the coming years will tell the tale as to where Bitcoin fits. I mean, I think some of the concepts and principles that have come out of Bitcoin around virtual currencies are here to stay. Whether Bitcoin's here to stay is that time will tell. One of the early proponents of Bitcoin was a Silicon Valley techpreneur named Wences Caceres. Recently he said his suggestion around investing in Bitcoin was take an unimportant amount of your net worth, say 1%, put it in Bitcoins and then just set it aside for 5 years. In 5 years, he said there's probably, in my estimation, a 20% chance that it will be worthless. There's a 30% chance that you'll see some small appreciation or small depreciation in your investment, and there's a 50% chance that you're going to have made a great deal of money on your Bitcoin investment. So, as I said, he's a strong proponent of Bitcoin, and he's obviously very bullish on its future. In general, as I said, I don't give investment advice, I would say, but I think the one thing that he says there that's important is, whatever you put into Bitcoin, be willing to use because it's extremely volatile. So the last thing I'll bring you up to speed with is the fork. That just happened the next couple of weeks. As I said, there's no central authority for Bitcoin, and two groups within the Bitcoin community could not agree on the future direction. There was one group that wanted to install new software, add new functionality, make it much more robust, and there's another group that were more conservative, wanted to stick with the current software. So the robust people, they went off, eventually they couldn't agree nobody could agree, so the robust people created a new currency called Bitcoin Cash, which is going to trade separately and have its own blockchain and have its own everything, and the regular Bitcoin will go on as it is. So as I said, it's a very dynamic environment. It's a very interesting place. Lots of people have made a lot of money in Bitcoin. Lots of people have lost a lot of money in Bitcoin. So caveat emptor if you want to dive in. But it's fascinating to follow. If you're interested in the Silk Road story, there's a recent book that came out by Nick Bilton called American Kingpin. And it's all about this Dread Pirate Roberts character and his story, and it's quite fascinating. I haven't read the book, but I've read Bilton's book about Twitter, and if it's of that caliber, I'm sure it'll be excellent. So there's a brief history of Bitcoin. Thanks for your time, and have a great day.